Hello and welcome to Premier Study in Investing. It's great to have you. Thanks for stopping by. What's up? Thanks for joining me on this video from Premier Study in Investing. We're going to be looking at the most macro level economic pieces that I've seen some podcasters kind of struggle with, especially when they start to take some of these basic facts and turn them into ratios. And so we're going to look at 4 pieces of information that are ultra critical that I think is more important than trying to get into some of the ideas of, well, what is the default rate on credit cards, or what is the consumer borrowing, or the consumer sentiment from Michigan, or JOLTS or jobs quits, or some of these other pieces, right? Let's just try to keep it basic, focus on the big things. I'm calling it basic macro, U.S. data 2023 and 2024. I'm going to be looking at 4 windows. We're going to start in this top left one, which basically shows us the numbers behind the 2023 budget. So let's start with this green bar here. I'm going to just keep it really easy numbers. We're going to drop that second decimal, and we're just going to go with 6.1 trillion was spent in 2023. So last year, U.S. government spent $6.1 trillion. Let's go over and look at this blue bar here. How much did they bring in revenue? 4.4. If you take the 6.1 and you divide it by 4.4, you're going to get 1.38 something, which means we overspent by 38%. We spent 38% more than we brought in, would be another way to say it. If you can keep those two numbers in your mind, 6.1, the big number, and 4.4, the smaller number, you can obviously subtract the small one from the big one, and you'll get the deficit. You know that we ran a deficit, so you only really have to remember 2 numbers and be able to still do subtraction. So that's easy. How about let's jump down to this bottom one. I think most people have this in their minds, but if you don't, national debt has now surpassed 34 trillion, but it's fairly close to 34 trillion. Okay, that's a good one. Most people get that right, but sometimes when they start to compare this box to the blue box, or this second lower graph to the blue box, and they try to start turning it into ratios, that's when it can fall apart for people. So let's take a look at this top one. It's federal government current expenditures interest payments. So this is the amount of interest expense that we have on our federal debt, and this is billions of dollars. And if you run up to Q4 2023, it's just over 1 trillion. You can see it's been a huge run up in the expense, which is due to the level of debt that's held, but also the percentage rate that is being paid on some of that debt, $1 billion, and then we've doubled that in interest expense here, over $1 trillion. So you can see when some of these people talk about corporate real estate and different companies having to roll over their debt at more expensive levels, you can see that here. It's basically twice as expensive, right? We were only paying 500 billion a few years back, now $1 trillion. And again, some of that is because this has come up. Now, the interesting thing is if you take the 1 trillion and you compare it to all that was spent, right? Because that's interesting thing to think about. Of all the money that we spent in 2023, how much of it went to interest payments? Well, all you're going to do is take 1 divided by 6.1, and you're going to get something like 16%, right? 16% of the money that our government spent went just servicing debt. Okay, that's kind of interesting. I don't know what it's like in your household if you're holding debt, how much of your income is going to, well, there's a difference. How much you're spending of your overall spending is going to pay down debt. You could, if you wanted to, say, well, what if we want to compare it to revenue? In this case, you'd take the 1 divided by the blue, 4.4, and you're going to come up with something in the ballpark of 23%. So it's like, well, 23% of the money that came in, we needed to use that to pay the debt, right? And then, you could say whatever you want to do with the deficit part, that orange block in the top, But this is kind of interesting. It'd be 16% of what was spent or 23% of what was brought in. All right, let's go and look at this bottom one. This is the assets, total assets less eliminations from consolidation. Wednesday level. So this is the Fed's balance sheet that you hear people talk about a lot, that it really increased quite dramatically. It was somewhere around 4 trillion, a little bit. We'll just say around 4 trillion prior to 2020. and then it jumped like crazy. There was a lot of bailouts, STEMI checks. There was all kinds of provisions for PPE checks for businesses, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It actually grew during 2022 and 2023 up to almost 9 trillion. So that was really nuts. And then you've seen that the Fed has talked about reducing the size of the balance sheet. And graphically, you can see that it's come from maybe 9 trillion at the peak to maybe a little bit under 8, maybe 7.8 trillion in 2024. I'm making this early February 2024. So you could see what progress has been made, or you could see how much progress has yet to be made, needs to be made to get back down. You'd be talking about, if you want to get back to where we kind of were before, about cutting out another $3 trillion. So in closing, I think these are the 4 or 5 points that you need to try to keep in your mind, the big numbers. That government brought in 4.4 trillion in revenue. They spent 6.1. They're paying $1 trillion per year in interest expense on a $34 trillion debt. If you figure the number out on that, it's about 3% that they're paying on the 34 trillion. And then they're trying to reduce their balance sheet. They've done some work. So in closing, just those are the big pieces to keep in mind before we get into some of these more granular things, like how much liquidity is being brought in for the banks through the discount window. Like we said, the default rates, mortgage rates, new mortgage issues, new housing starts, PCE, CPI, unemployment rate revisions, right? You can spend a ton of time like in all that stuff. And the people that talk about it, especially on podcasts, you can tell that from their marketing angle, they want to get in front of the camera. They want to get in front of potential customers. It's definitely a marketing angle. So they'll give you like some of the large scale ideas, but obviously the idea is to funnel customers down into some kind of subscription newsletter or some kind of Substack, or probably just a lot of people would like to gain more assets under management, right? I mean, that's kind of the whole deal. And so they're not going to give away every bit of their secret sauce, right? I mean, all the granular research that they did and why they think that this is their kind of one step ahead at the Fed, they're not going to give that to us on podcasts. And so what they're going to kind of do is throw us some little ideas that if we go to try to re-explain it to somebody, or we try to really like make an investment decision or kind of a hypothesis about the future, it's going to be a little rough. I mean, unless you have a subscription to FactSet or you dig deep into some public data, maybe you'll be able to do it. But my experience has been, and I don't know about you guys, but my experience has been that listening to podcasters, it's like, man, you guys are getting really into the weeds. And one of the things that, like we did recently with portfolio management or modern portfolio theory, is just to run some statistical data on a bunch of the sector ETFs and just find the winners. We found that for the higher growth strategies, VGT was often preferred, mixed with some other things, to pare down your risk. And so, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to look at it, but macro is important, especially thinking about these rate cuts, the long-term bond. Do you want to be in high growth equities, or do you want to kind of play the rate cut game on the bonds with higher duration? Hey, I mean, I'm actually been thinking about that a lot and leaning much more towards the TLT long bond strategy. Arthur Hayes and some other people have been interesting, saying stay away from long bond. Luke Groman, he's big on energy. So these people are all like super in it, right? I mean, they're doing it all the time. I'm probably more like a person that's just, watching podcasts, taking my education, working through CFA and some of these things and thinking, like what, So if that's like you, try to keep those big 4 things in mind, at least before you get into some of this other stuff. If you have it in mind, you'll be able to track those conversations better. We'll talk to you guys next time. Thanks.